1, Brazil perhaps is number 2, and Colombia is there somewhere. So do you want to use those resources, and how? And then there is this renewable revolution. How is it all started with renewables in Latin America? Well, you have hydro, one of the river solutions. You have to understand this is very clean. And some, dams, you can even say that this is renewables and that they are not as harmful as some may say. But we have wind and solar, and wind and solar are abundant most places in Latin America. In Brazil, we heard yesterday, load factors around 40% now in wind. And that's interesting. That's about the highest you can get in Europe. And in Colombia, for what we have, for the data we have, could be similar. But Argentina has lots of wind as well. So you cannot think of it as you think of wind power in Europe, because we have hydro and we have sun. And that makes the economics of resources completely different. And complementarity here is completely different, how it complements in those industrialized countries. And we haven't considered, and this hasn't been introduced in the discussion, geothermal electricity. There are some resources, not little, but there's something to do with this. So policy and regulations is shifting. But as my predecessor in this panel points out, we don't know how regulators are moving in Latin America with respect to these issues. In terms of technology, we mustn't forget the science behind and the engineering behind this. The load curve, and people talking about the best technology, the cheapest technology, I don't know what they're talking about. It depends on what sort of solution you are trying to focus on. So you have to think of peaking plants, and you have to think of baseload plants. And when you're talking about renewables and gas and coal, well, you have to in some way fit them in what is in the purpose. And so there is not a single machine that is efficient for all solutions, and that's you have to take into consideration. So in this sense, what about renewables, and what about shale gas, and what about some thermal renewable energy instead of shale gas or coal? So the transition would be challenging and would be very interesting. And so we have to take a look at policy. And policy in the industrialized world has been very active regarding to what sort of resources they would like to be in place. So they have created incentives for renewables and for solar in England and in Germany and Spain. All over Europe, there are some sort of goals they have to meet. And feed-in tariffs has been the most popular solution. And some people criticize it, but the Brits in the new energy model that they're implementing, well, they have a variation of feed-in tariffs, and if you have an efficient solution, you just try to figure out how you best put it in place. In countries with middle incomes, you have most of Latin America, and it's important to note that Colombia is not the country that favors most renewables and friendliness towards the environment. And as you could have appreciated speaker yesterday, we argue that we don't need it because we're fairly clean. But you have to be careful. You have to be careful when you argue in this direction, because the temptation will be always use coal, and coal may be not environmentally friendly, as most of us know. So the world is moving in this direction, and you see the numbers in terms of mechanisms to promote renewables and subsidies and so on and so forth. And the goals, you know, if you have goals for renewables, now we have 117 countries involved with, you know, with some sort of goals, and that includes Colombia, that has goals that are very limited and almost unimportant. And feed-in tariffs, as I said, is very popular, but all mechanisms have been in place, and they're moving in the direction of contributing to reducing, mitigating CO2 emissions. How is this evolving? The role in terms of wind resources, this is well known and is reported in the literature and is reported in the network, and everyone knows the speed of penetration of global wind is flattening a bit. The rate of new windmills are not now at the 20% average as it was in the past. So it's for the first time, Perry may correct me, for the first time solar installations have exceeded the number of gigawatts installed in wind power. But what is interesting is that Brazil now is number 10. And for the first time, we have Latin American countries being active on these issues. Brazil leading, the very top at a very fast speed, because they found that there is a niche and there is opportunities. But also Mexico is doing a good job in this sense. And you'll see Uruguay in comparable terms, about 500, 600 megawatts already in place, and the goal is 1.2 gigawatts. That's quite a lot. Chile is moving in this direction, Peru as well. So Latin America, that was one reluctant to these solutions, are finding niches and opportunities in terms of renewables. And the issue, and I'm going to address this, regarding costs and poverty, we will see in a minute. Solar would be very interesting, it's very interesting in Latin America. Around the world, it's not 20%, but 30% or 40% penetration. In Latin America, it's even higher, but from a very, very low beginning. So you only have 200 megawatts in Latin America, whereas in the rest of the world you have 139 gigawatts, and this is 2013. So new market structures for all this, complicated. It doesn't matter much how you begin. It doesn't matter if you're a monopolistic design of markets or a market that is working in competitive terms. All of them, you know, set goals and try to meet the goals. And for this, you have to make, for the time being, you're working on incentives. And for example, in Colombia, you don't have incentives for renewables in terms of the new renewables, but you have incentives for hydropower and you have incentives for coal. So they are trying to change their legislation, and we'll see how it works. But in the future, how much of this is going to be in place? And I have a thinking about it. Each technology is specific, doesn't seem, and again, efficient to have one size fits all. this is not going to be the case, and more so in Latin America, where you have, as I said before, you have water, you have sun, and you have wind. And this doesn't work they don't work by themselves. The issue, and Professor Newbery is talking about aggregators, but since this is not taking place in a very orderly manner in Latin America, you will have millions of producers instead of few, less than 100 producers in Colombia right now. So if you have millions of producers in Colombia and millions of producers of electricity in the world, so there are lots of challenges. And if you think ahead, long ahead, this would be, I would suppose, in some circumstances, package. You will have your house and you'll have the solar panel, or you have an aggregator of offering, of supplying electricity services within it. So would it be like a washing machine or a computer in your house? I don't know. I don't know. How soon will this take place? I don't know. The price formation, and this is a big challenge as well. Expansion signals, I don't see where you can get it in this way. But there will be contracts, probably, I don't know. Professor Newbery is suggesting some of it. We'll need a balancing mechanism, a clearing mechanism. And we need the network somewhere. So the challenge would be the transition and distribution systems. How are you going to reward them? How are they going to be in place? Is this going to be like, I doubt it, like the cellular phones or not? I don't think so. So you need some capacity mechanisms in place, and for the Europeans and for the Americans, these are new things. We've been experimenting this, as I said before, because of the hydro volatility and hydro seasonality. And in that sense, we've done it, and I don't know how successful we've been doing it for the last 20 years. But we've been doing it, and with different shapes and forms. Are there new business models being convergent? Similar sort of stories. For the time being, this is not the case because the beginning has been different. So Latin America perhaps have some time to think about it, but not much. If things carry on at this speed, situation is going to be complicated for incumbent utilities, and they have to think fast, quickly, how to move ahead, and so they don't run into problems as E.ON and all these European companies that are in trouble, and because they are losing market share, and the shares are going down badly. Perry reports 50% losses of share value of E.ON or RWE, and in Germany. So that's challenging for utilities in Latin America. So the conclusion, and I ran out of time now, is how much policy and planning will be in place, how much markets and strategy, are the producers, new producers that are consumers, very strategic about this? It's different. It's going to be different. So all sorts of shapes will be in place, and we have to, and the process will, I hope, will give us signals, so we'll learn how to move ahead with this. Thank you very much.
Preguntas para el profesor Issac.
Any questions for Professor Issac?
Thank you very much. That was thought-provoking. Particularly, I like your style in
putting everything in questions. You're asking questions more than giving us answers. I think it's time for many questions to be resolved, and I think you're spot on in terms of the answer to questions very much depends on where you are and how the policy and goals and so forth. I think a couple of areas in particular, I'm coming up, of course, from California, where these issues that you mentioned, distributed generation in particular, is very much at play. And the regulators, I think the roles of the regulators in many of these countries is becoming very critical. They can either influence the outcome, they can hamper it, they can delay it. In many cases, the regulators are actually trying to protect the monopoly utilities. And it's the example that I can think of is the Uber. You know, Uber is offering a taxi service at a lower cost and presumably better service. And in many cities around the world, the regulators are preventing the competitive technology that offers better price because they're protecting the monopoly, existing incumbent monopoly. So I think that's among the many challenges you mentioned. That is actually one of the big challenges that I believe facing many mature economies. And I think the regulators are, in my view, and maybe Peter can tell us about the experience in Australia, I think the regulators find themselves in an awkward position of not knowing who is the, is it the customers who in some cases benefit from these new technologies, or is it, should they protect the incumbents who provide some of the essential services such as maintenance of the network? So I was just curious if you had any thoughts on that.
More than a question is a reflection, and you're giving us some answers in terms of what sort of business models may be like. You mentioned Uber. I mean, the regulators may be slow about moving ahead with how to best regulate or the new businesses. And I don't know the capabilities to do so. So maybe this, if the rate of learning curves carry on as we observed in the past, we would see it would be much more difficult to regulate. And then you have to tax sun and to tax wind, and that would be a case for trying to understand how to make it a more orderly operational market. I don't know what Professor Newbery may have to say about this, and what is his thoughts on these lines.
Well, I think there's a very important role for the regulators to play because they determine what is allowed and what is not. I think the utilities have to think much more constructively about what they need in order to make the investments viable. And if the regulator is doing a good job, the utility will have to accept that there will be competition from a variety of new sources. But the competition should not be destructive of assets that remain valuable. It should be destructive of practices that are no longer viable. And I think the real challenge for utilities is to predict what future regulation is going to evolve towards. I mean, in my country we have a new system of incentive regulation which pays considerable attention to innovation, and we have challenge funds to develop the innovation. And the risk for a utility that is not innovative is that it will invest in assets that may become stranded, and the regulator will say, we gave you plenty of warning that you had to adopt best practice, and if you didn't choose the right solution, then you may find you have stranded assets. So the utilities have to be very foresightful about what future regulation is going to be. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge. And I think transmission companies have always been, if you like, where the brains of the industry is. Distribution companies in the past have not necessarily been so on the ball and innovative because theirs was much more a passive role. That's changing, and those companies are going to have to be much fleeter of foot in predicting how the world is going to change.
Yeah, I'm Gabriel Anandraja from University College London, and thanks for the presentation. You mentioned about technology, market and business models, and another important aspect is when it comes to renewable, especially wind, the public acceptance. In UK and other European countries, including Germany, people have some issues on this. Especially, we had to install the wind power plants where resource potentials are. And then we need to connect with overhead cables to the national, for the main grid lines. And we had to install cables over the household. And many people think wind farms are beautiful, but however, it's still something, these are ugly or something. So do you think when it comes to large-scale investment in Latin America in the future, if it is wind, then is there any issue, or would it be, the public acceptance be an issue for Latin American regions?
In Latin America, that's a challenge, but you have to consider this. When you see the Brazilian case, as they mentioned yesterday, the wind farms are located where there are not many people, and that's important. In Colombia, the situation is slightly different. Wind farms are located in Guajira, and there are not many people there, but natives from the area are very much opposing these initiatives. So you have to deal with this. So wind farms in Colombia particularly are not everywhere, and that the households, the typical households of middle income won't have anything to say with this regard. In Argentina, in Patagonia, I think there are plenty of resources for wind farms. You can find not very populated areas, so perhaps it's not the same as you would find in densely populated areas as you have it in Europe. Peter Hadley was telling me about this, the problems of birds and the challenges of how to go about this. I don't know. I don't know how would be the reaction to projects of wind in Colombia. What is certain in Latin America is that we have lots of problems trying to get a new reservoir in place, and that because that displaces lots of people, and that creates problems from the river flows. And we'll see that in Colombia at least two major projects have been stopped by the public reacting against it. So it's like everywhere. Any solution to new plants and to new energy generation will be problematic. So that's why you have to think of the lesser problem with respect to this. And sun power may be part of the solution, and you have to think broadly. You'd have to think of a single solution for a big problem, and perhaps in that sense you make it more democratic in a way and more participatory. So if population wants electricity, you have to find ways to go around it.
Yo voy a hacer la pregunta en español.
I'm going to ask the question in Spanish. I'm asking you, but anyone can answer it. The three of you spoke about the difficulty to promote microgeneration. because of the opposition of the utilities, because they know they're losing market share. And I want to add an additional point of view to that, which is the tariffs in Latin America. The residential tariffs or rates have capacity charges mixed. They cannot charge all the items separately, so everything is included under energy. So as a social issue, it's impossible to charge one customer very little for a capacity charge. So I forget which one of you talked about that, but the way to do it is to have companies not charging for energy but for capacity, not for use but for capacity, for the capacity they are delivering. But in Latin America, I don't see that as a possibility. Especially you who are a regulator, you said you are not doing it yet, but what are you planning on doing? What do you think it's possible to change the model?
Have an answer to your question. What I think it's interesting is that we yesterday have listened to a parallel to this discussion to need to allocate these costs to access charges in a similar way as to what happened to the telecom industry. But I just would like to point that I believe last week we had a decision in Brazil in the Supreme Court that prevented charging for access in the telecom industry for people who are not using it too much, not consuming it too much. So there is a political question, a political barrier to be faced.
Well, I think that's a good example where the regulator has to adapt to the changing circumstances. And clearly, if one of the obvious consequences, it's the rich people who install the ability to generate their own electricity. And if the poor people are finishing up paying for the distribution system which the rich still use at the night time, then one would hope a little bit of political momentum would cause the regulators to adapt the tariff structure.
De esa manera damos por...
So we finish the plenary session, electrical development in Latin America and the Caribbean, business model, services and challenges. Now we want to invite you to have a coffee break, and it will last approximately 30 minutes. Thank you.